Joining me now, and welcome, gentlemen, are three experts in the field. Anthony Wonke is an Emmy-winning filmmaker and director of the film The Hunt For Jihadi John. Richard Kerbaj, producer and a Sunday Times security correspondent, also producer of the film, as I say, The Hunt For Jihadi John, and General Sir Richard Barrons, who was the head of the British Joint Forces Command during the search for Jihadi John, where we're discussing the title of the film, which is the event itself that happened, the hunt itself for Jihadi John, how he was hunted down in ISIS territory and eventually killed. Now, of course, listeners will know that the man's real name, Maajid Nawaz, was a British citizen from London. So let me begin there, Richard, because through your work, not just in filmmaking, but also as the Sunday Times security correspondent, you look at radicalisation extensively. Why do you think that the infamous execution cell in ISIS was composed of British citizens and, say, not Iraqis or Syrians who you'd presume would be more angry at whatever got them angry, but instead Maajid Nawaz comes from London to head up that brutal execution cell? What is it about British radicalisation?
Thanks for having us on your programme, for supporting this film. I think the Brits in particular became such a great and powerful propaganda tool for ISIS. So the first film, if you recall, coincided with the launch of the ISIS so-called caliphate. That was back in July, and July 2014. And at that point, they were trying to give some publicity around ISIS, and they were trying to sort of recruit people from overseas, particularly from Britain, and many did go. And then it wasn't until really several months later that the video came out with Nawaz. At that point, we sort of just knew him as a masked man who was wielding a knife to an innocent journalist, US journalist, Jim Foley. And it immediately had an enormous propaganda impact. And for them, it was seen as a complete success. So they replicated this video time and again, and of course several other innocent people were killed, including British aid workers, David Haynes and Alan Henning. And so I think that was the key bit that they were after. They wanted an English-speaking radical, English-speaking extremist, and in a way it was a success story for them in the context of what Nawaz did, not because they thought that he was going to be successful, but I mean initially, and I think General Barrons will be able to get into that a bit more as well, but I think initially it was almost like an experiment that somehow went right, and then he went on to sort of encapsulate and represent everything that is evil and destructive and disgusting about ISIS itself, and that's why it created such a huge media hype, and that's why I think there were a lot of lessons learned.
General Barrons, this man, Maajid Nawaz, did leave the country at one point to travel to join a jihadist group, but was refused or rejected and returned to Britain, and then managed to leave again and join ISIS in Iraqi and Syrian-held territories at the time. Why was he, I mean, of course, that clearly indicates that our security services were aware of him. How was he able to then leave the country after, one would assume, and I think the film goes into, that he was being monitored by our security services?
So this is a really difficult judgment for the security services, because on the one hand, if they decided that everyone who had a link to radical opinion or terrorism was prevented from leaving, what would effectively be instituting in this country is internment. And you'd intern people and not let them go, and that would produce a bow wave of rejection. We would say, well, look at our values and standards, and yet we're inhibiting people from going about their lives on the flimsiest of evidence. And on the other hand, if your judgment is we're not sure we'll let them go, then terrible things like the journey Maajid Nawaz then took will happen. That there is probably no perfect outcome to this, but we always need to come back to the vital point that in dealing with terrorism, we must start and stick to our values and standards and not join in a descent to the bottom.
Good point there. Anthony, you're the director of the film. Was it difficult to trace, because the film has Maajid Nawaz's voice recordings that one imagines have been acquired from the intelligence services. Now, in making a film, and correct me if they weren't acquired, because I don't know where they were acquired from, but in making a film like this, to get that sort of primary material, in effect raising it from the dead, because the man is no longer with us, but we hear his voice in this film. How does one even begin tracking down that kind of incredibly, I imagine, sensitive material for a film like this?
Well, I think one of the best things about this, or if you're making a film like this, is that you have support from our producer Richard and the characters that you take part, and they're all expert in their fields. And we realised that there was a lot of archive about him that existed already. Channel 4 News had done obviously when they found out about who it was. The Channel 4 News had traced where he went to school, Quinton Kingston, and a documentary had been made about the school at the time, and so rushes existed of Mohammed Emwazi.
Sorry, what existed?
Rushes, so actual footage.
For the listeners, if you explain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there is actually footage in the film of Mohammed Emwazi in the playground and playing around and being an innocent schoolboy. And
there's a particular part where he covers his mouth.
Yes.
He has the habit of covering his mouth.
Yeah.
It's striking because it speaks to a vulnerability that we don't often imagine when we think of the man, the terrorist. What is he doing when he's covering his mouth in this footage?
Well, there were reports that he basically had problems with his bad breath. And I think that this, whether or not it's speculative or not, but there we have the teachers in the film who kind of spent a lot of time with him, and they speculate that this probably led to him being quite an isolated individual, that he was described as a passenger, he was more of a follower, and whether this is part of the supposition that exists in the film, is that whether this leads to a sort of the beginning of a psychological state of mind for him that sends him on this trajectory. I think there are other factors involved when he kind of met various other kind of radicals and was persuaded to sort of generally lead a life of what he thought was a career, of being a sort of careerist jihadist, and this is what he was wanting to do.
General Barrons, how important is building such a psychological profile when it comes to the hunt itself? Because you led our country's hunt for him, and the bad breath is maybe one element. There's probably a whole bunch of other stuff that you would have had to put forward as a psychological profile. How does that inform your operations?
So, I mean, I had a very small part in the hunt. This is very much a matter for the nation's intelligence services. But the point you're making is a really good one, in that trying to understand how a British citizen is radicalised to the point where they cut the heads off other citizens in this terrible act. And as you've described it, it's quite common. So individuals who may be isolated or weaker or lack confidence but can't find their place in life are easier prey to a very well constructed radical message that gives them purpose and status and meaning, and that's often amplified by alienation. So in the case of Emwazi, because the security services spoke to him, he felt that the eye was on him, and he wore that to some degree as a badge of pride, but it did push him away from his own country. And that's a very common feature. So in looking for people who may become terrorists, that path to radicalisation is now pretty well understood.
Richard,
and just an extension to the great point that General Barrons has just made. I mean, you don't.
Before you do, I want to add a question as well, so you can combine it with what you were going to say, because on the psychological profiling, there is this question about his marriage, and our security forces, when Mohammed Emwazi travelled, met with his fiancée and informed her and her family that they had strong suspicions of this man, and then of course also met with a second fiancée he had in Kuwait, and all of that pattern, psychological pattern, and speak to us about that, and as well add your point to it as well.
I mean, the point that I was going to add on, and I'll address your question in a second, but is that you don't come under the surveillance of the security services and the police if you're just an innocent man getting about. Emwazi started to become fairly radicalised back in the days, back in 2009, and that's as a result of his connections to two extremists from the UK, particularly in London, who would go on to join Al-Qaeda in Somalia. And there were a number of disruption operations that were run by MI5 and Scotland Yard, as is revealed in the film. And the reason being is because they wanted to disrupt the likelihood of him travelling out to join terrorists. His initial attempt was to go out and join Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Of course, at that time, he pretended he was going out to safari. And then subsequently, he wanted to get out to Syria, and they tried to stop him as well. So back to the point that you make about the psychological impact this could have had on him. I mean, he had this sort of perceived sort of persecution complex. And like many extremists do, and you would know something about that yourself as someone who sort of travelled on that path of sort of extremism and has come out of it successful at the other end. And then he basically started using that to kind of bolster his belief that the state was somehow against him. Now, the state were against his extremist links. Of course they were. They should be. And the state was investigating him, and they'd be incorrect not to investigate him. But then to sort of somehow make the link that as a result of him being investigated by the state, he would then went on to become a terrorist. Well, that's not true, because he was already on that trajectory to become an extremist,
which is why they
and a
were
violent
investigating
extremist.
him.
Precisely.
Did anything, and again, this is a question, there's no assumption here, did anything related to the marriages or his desperation to marry, the fact that our security services intervened, and probably rightly so. If I were a fiancé to somebody that was a terrorist, I'd want to know, right? So they intervened twice, once in Britain, once in Iraq. 2 engagements were called off. Mohammed Amwazi wanted to get married and couldn't. He gets to ISIS territory and he does marry a jihadi wife. And so does any of that inform operationally the hunt? Is this man a man who's desperate to marry, and did he slip up as a result?
So it's clear there's an aspect to his character where he wanted a family relationship, and he lost 2 as a result of his activities. And as you described, the security service telling his fiancées that they were in a difficult place. With his ISIS bride, he acquired a weakness in the sense that this really mattered to him, and maintaining contact with his bride and child meant that there was a digital or a physical trace that intelligence services could look out for, and that's how these things generally work. You are looking for a way to identify a start to a trail.
Of course, in the film, Colonel Steve Warren, as a Pentagon spokesman, said he was very careful about his actions, but you know what? They all slip up eventually, and when they do, we kill them. And was that the slip up? Was it that he wanted to see this bride, and that revealed a pattern of behaviour, or how was he eventually killed? Because he was killed by drone, wasn't he?
In the end, he was killed by a drone strike, but it was a much more complex business, and it took months. It started with the intelligence services analysing the videos in order to identify him, from small things like the veins in his hands, his voice print, his eyes. So they needed somewhere to start, and actually that was relatively easy. But then in order to locate him in a place like Raqqa, where there's no coalition presence on the ground and you're dealing with a very hostile environment, then you're going to find him as a result of a number of things. That he will communicate in some way with somebody, both personally and digitally. He will deal with humans on the ground in Raqqa who support and supply him, and that provides a trail. So in order to find someone like Mohammed Nawaz, you're going to look for all of those things.
Richard, I want to move to, because now the man, he's been, as a result of these operations, he's been tracked down, he's been killed by drone, but of course the consequence of his actions on the victims of those who he killed remain with us to this day. Now, you mentioned David Haines earlier. Of course, this Mohammed Amwazi unfortunately killed David Haines. He beheaded him on camera. But David Haines leaves a family behind. He leaves, at the time, a daughter who was 15, who is now, I believe, 22. And she's now, in her own right, campaigning for various things. But on the question of these victims of David Haines, the daughter is in the film. How are people able to move on after having gone through such a horrific experience? I shudder to think if that was my father, treated in this way by this terrorist.
What's incredible about all the contributors in the film, particularly the hostages and the families of hostages, is that they're not after revenge, and it's not that they've forgiven what the actions that took place, but they want to sort of move on with their lives, but they also want to move on to do better things, to contribute to the world. Because to sort of elaborate on that point, there were a lot of people who went out to Syria who went out there for the right purposes. They went out there to do aid. They went out there to report on the situations on the ground, which helped inform some of the policy decisions that were made by Britain and the US and other countries. And there's this kind of overwhelming message by Jim Foley's mother, the US reporter who was killed by Amwazi, and her message is that we need to uphold ourselves to a much higher standard. We need to be better. And that's kind of what they live by. That's what gets them by. And also, regarding the friendships...
And is Bethany, the daughter, doing that now?
What Bethany's doing is Bethany has formed this great friendship with another hostage who
Motka.
was released.
Motka.
So this is Federico Motka, who's an Italian aid worker who was in captivity. He was held with David Haynes for 14 months, and they were kidnapped at the same time. And since his release and Bethany's father's death, they've become really great friends. And now Bethany actually is starting up a campaign, which she's going to launch this summer, to go out there and locate where her father was buried and relocate his
because of course
and repatriate
for
his
the
remains.
closure, because
Correct.
of course they've never repatriated his body. Anthony, as the only one here today with us who hasn't come from a security background but rather a filmmaking background, Richard mentioned Motka. Of course, we're aware that our country has a policy of not paying ransoms to hostages, whereas Motka being Italian, it is believed the Italians paid a ransom for his release. David Haynes, why this is relevant is David Haynes and Motka were captured by ISIS together and held for the most part of their captivity together. The Italian government allegedly paid a ransom. Reportedly paid a ransom for Motka, and he was released, but David Haynes didn't receive anything from the British government. As somebody from a non-security background, what are your immediate reflections on that policy? Of course, the security establishment and people that follow these have their own views on that, but what are your, let's say, for want of a better term, layman's perspectives on that?
I think I can sort of, it's almost that you take consideration from what Federico thinks about it, because when he realised that he was being taken, and that he assumed, I think because he was abducted at the same time, he assumed that he was going to be released at the same time. And when there were these kind of movements that he was going to be set free, I think he just assumed that so was David Haynes. And for him, I think it was an utter bittersweet moment. And to this day, he'll probably still be scarred by it. And he talks about it in the film in depth. And I think it's a really contradictory feeling for him. And I think in some ways, that's probably, from my point of view, I look at it and it's one of those very grey areas. I mean, what do you do in situations like that? I think Diane Foley, whose son James Foley was the first one to be executed, she actually found out and was confirmed that he was executed when she watched it on television. And that, you know, the fact as well that we then have David Petraeus, who's a 4-star general at the time, was saying that that again is a very difficult thing for families to deal with.
He's in the film, of course.
Yes,
General Petraeus.
So it's from a lay perspective as a filmmaker, I'm there not really to sort of cast any sort of judgments on it. It's really to sort of throw up these different arguments and points of view, and for people to kind of take from it what they will. But it is, it's a desperately complex issue, and I think one of the kind of very gracious things about Motka is that he realises that it's such a grey area, and that, you know, and I suppose it's to sort of talk about what Richard was discussing, is that, you know, for him this is insistence that his outlook is that he must take a sort of a higher moral ground than all of this.
Richard, one of the most harrowing moments described by Motka, who was in captivity with David Haynes, who Mohammed Amwazi beheaded, was that they were held in a cell together and that they were forced to fight 2 other prisoners.
They were forced to call, he calls that the Royal Rumble. So they're basically the ISIS captives, including Amwazi, who would go on to be called Jihadi John, forced him to fight 2 other prisoners, and those 2 other Western hostages were John Cantley, who's a photojournalist, a British photojournalist, and Jim Foley, the US reporter.
And the reason I'm asking you this is we know what happened to Jim Foley. Do we know what's happened to John Cantley?
There's been a lot of speculation about it.
Because he came to my Quilliam offices before he returned.
Right.
I mean, one question I have is why he went back, because of course he was held hostage, he was released, he came to see us at the Quilliam offices, we spoke to him for a long time, including Dr. Osama Hassan. He didn't tell us he was going to return, but of course he did return, and now nobody knows what his fate is.
There's been a lot of speculation about what's happened to him. It's unknown.
Yeah.
It's unknown.
So we don't know. Do we have any idea, General?
No, but the absence of any sign at all suggests that he's probably not survived.